No, grazie a lei. So thanks a lot for the invitation. I'm going to have to apologize for speaking in English, but unfortunately my Italian is way too crude to convey all these nice and subtle things that I have to say about the projects and about the VisitINPS program in general. What I would like to start with is trying to tell you how I think these projects really epitomize the benefits, the advantages of having a program like VisitINPS. The first thing might have, struck you as well, but these three projects are to start with by three young scholars. They're ambitious, they're talented, and I think the overall success of the VisitINPS programs is going to owe a lot to this eagerness by these young scholars to actually put their research out there. It's important because young scholars, they are not only more creative compared to old people like us, but they are also getting something out of it, which is that it's an investment in the future. By giving ownership, by giving responsibility in the public debate to young people, to young scholars, well, I think it's very much an investment in the future that you're doing, and that's important to mention. Now, of course, these three projects are also important because they are giving insights on things that are immediately policy relevant. Policy relevant questions here, well, in broad terms, there are of three kinds. I think what we're asking here is first, what are the returns to higher education? Does education foster innovation and growth? And can we reduce gender inequality, and how to do so? Does promoting women leadership is actually a good way to tackle gender inequality? So it will not have escaped you that, well, of course, there is a humongous literature in economics and in social sciences on these issues. So where does VisitINPS contribute here? I think first because of the use of administrative data, and in particular, the use of Italian administrative data. From that, you get new insights. Why? Well, because as you've seen, none of the things that we've looked at could have been looked at absent the quality, the precision of the universal administrative data that is being used. But there is also something more, which is about using Italian data for studying Italian policies. Because you might say, well, we already have Scandinavian data, we have data from the US, but when it comes to understanding the effect of Italian policies, there is only so much that you can learn from experiments or data elsewhere. Why? Because so much of the effects are going to depend on the interaction of the policy with specific institutional context. So if you do not study the effect of particular policies in Italy, there is no way you're going to be able to actually answer the questions that are relevant for Italian policymakers. Now, I also want to emphasize the fact that what these projects are contributing and what research in general is potentially contributing in terms of policy making goes way beyond the simple ex post policy evaluation. I think a lot of people have in mind a model where basically the policymakers decide about a policy, and then researchers are here just to evaluate ex post the policy and say, well, it's been effective or it's not been effective. I think that's a pretty limited view of how research can contribute. And these projects, I think, showcase that very much. That instead of just giving particular answers to very definite questions, in some sense they open even more questions than they are giving answers. And I think that's a good thing. Why? Well, because I think research, in a way, can contribute to public policy debate, not in giving the answers. Economists are not here to tell you what to do. Economists are here to essentially give more insights for the democratic debate. Research is here not to kill the debate by telling you, we know what to do. They're here to give you a lot of options. They're here to bring you new insights, to bring creative ideas. So they are here essentially to enrich the democratic debate, not to kill it. So how does it unfold in the context of these three projects? I think to start with, what's really striking is what Massimo described as this big Italian higher education puzzle. Why is it a puzzle? Well, it's the fact that you have, at the same time, a very low supply of higher education graduates in Italy compared to everywhere else. But at the same time, you have seemingly very low average returns to higher education. In particular, you have a very high level of unemployment of higher education graduates. So why is it a puzzle? Well, first because it does not fit the trend that we see in all OECD countries, where we see a rise in the high skill premium. But more importantly, it is totally at odds with the basic models that we have in mind, which is that, well, if there are few higher education graduates, they have a skill that is relatively rare in the labor market, and that should command, therefore, a high return. I think what Massimo's paper immediately shows us is that, well, it's probably, to start with, all about heterogeneity, in the sense that there are actually huge differences in returns across fields of study, and there are indeed a lot of fields of study, like STEMs, like medicine, like law, like business of education, where actually college graduates command a very high return, okay? But of course, there are also fields of study that seem to command very low returns, and therefore you have this big heterogeneity across fields, with essentially returns on business degree being 100% larger than humanity degree, conditional on graduating in higher education. One thing, though, that I really would like to see that was not there yet in the paper is to see how much of this heterogeneity in return is declining over cohorts, because what Massimo is looking at is a very, very long time period, and looking at these average returns over this very long time period, essentially starting from people who graduated in the 60s and 70s. What would be interesting is to understand to what extent this heterogeneity is persistent. But I think we're going to find, in any case, quite a lot of persistence in this heterogeneity in returns. So the big question is, why? Again, for economists, it's a bit of a puzzle, because we would expect that because some of these fields are commanding a high return, there is a natural, so to speak, market effect by which the people would want to enroll more in these fields, and therefore, by increasing the supply of these skills in the labor market, decrease their returns over time. So there are two ways to think about it, essentially. One, which is, well, let's not worry about it. This would be potential answer 1 and 2. Let's not worry about it. It's all, optimal in some sense. People are just doing the right thing. There are another way to think about it, which is more worrying and more interesting for policymakers, which is that, well, there might be huge inefficiencies here. So why might we think that actually it's not a problem? First, because, well, it might just be because it's not just the financial returns that people look at. They look at many other things, many non-financial, non-pecuniary returns when they are making their choice of fields. In some sense, in a country that is so proud about, its Boccaccio, its Leopardi, and all these, great writers and poets, yes, of course, there might be some social prestige about, knowing Canti by heart and so on and so forth, and therefore people might be essentially, when choosing their fields, well, also factoring in these kind of social return, social prestige effects. It might also be that, well, the careers in business, in law, and so on and so forth are commanding higher returns on average, but there might be a much higher variance as well. Of course, you might, on average, make more, but you might also be much more likely to be at the very bottom or at the very top of the income distribution, and people might, be risk averse, and they would rather have a lower return, but with a certainty, than huge uncertain returns. It turns out, and that's a bit what Massimo is doing, but much more could be done in this, that, well, it's not just about this, because it seems like humanities are dominated throughout the distribution, okay? So then, well, we might think that there is potentially some inefficiency going on there. What would be that the type of inefficiencies that we care about? Well, first, this is something that Massimo didn't really emphasize, but I think it's actually really important. There might be some huge inefficiencies on the supply side of education. It might be a misallocation because actually there are too few positions in these STEM fields, in law, in medicine, and so on and so forth. We know that numerus clausus imposes some strict limitations on the number of students that can go into the medical studies, in law, and so on and so forth. What does that create? Well, essentially monopoly power. These education fields are just commanding higher returns because they're getting rents, okay? And in that sense, the policy response would be to rethink the optimal allocation of the supply of education positions in these fields. The other way to think about it is to think about it in terms of, well, it's the problem of frictions in the enrollment process, and that's very much what Massimo was emphasizing. This idea that we also see a lot in a recent US literature that is saying, well, we see a lot of kids, for instance, from low-income backgrounds, from deprived backgrounds, that are very top students. They have high grades, but still they don't go to Ivy League colleges. They don't go to Harvard. They don't go to Princeton. What is explaining that they are not making this active choice? And the idea is that, well, they might not know about the returns, okay? So by trying to create this scorecard, by trying to give some information about the different returns in different fields of education, you're trying to get at this. I think it's a very important area of research and important area for policy making, but I would like to emit two little cautionary notes about this. Of course, we know that information might matter. But the thing that is extremely important is that information that you have in mind is about giving information on the average return. But we know that there is huge heterogeneity at the individual returns in accessing different fields, okay? What that means is that essentially people might know that on average, well, yeah, they might be better off doing business or education, but they might also know that compared to this average, they might be much lower or much higher. Not only they might have private information, but also they might form beliefs about it. And these beliefs might be biased, okay? So it's also important to address the heterogeneity in information and in beliefs about these private individual returns if you want to, in some sense, solve the potential frictions in the enrollment process. Why do I believe, given the evidence that Massimo has given us, that this is an important thing going on? Well, I'm not going to try to be too technical, but it's essentially showing that the IV estimates compared to the OLS estimate is much larger. What does that mean? It's essentially taking students that are going to particular fields because some of their teachers are suggesting them to go to these particular fields. And for these particular students, their returns are higher. What that means is that, well, there is some differences in the returns. The teachers might know, they might have private information about the fact that, well, this student might actually do better than other students in enrolling in that particular field. So there is a lot of heterogeneity in returns, and they matter. And because the students are also from themselves private beliefs about their private returns, it's important to address this as well. There is another dimension that also comes out. It's the impact of peers. What Massimo tells us is that, well, if you essentially look at what other people from your peer group have been choosing in terms of field, well, there is actually an impact of these choices on your own choice. And of course, that might not be correlated with your own returns. And therefore, it's also important to think about this, which is that, well, there is a lot of things that happen because of the environment, the peers, and so on and so forth. And it's important to address that as well when you want to address the potential frictions in this enrollment process. Okay? So now, all of this is extremely interesting, but it only talks about private returns to education. In other words, what we have in mind is a world where we're taking just one individual and we want to know where he's going to get the highest return. Is it if I put him into law? Is it if I put him into medicine? Is it if I put him into engineering, and so on and so forth? But in that world, it could be all what we call job market signaling. It's essentially saying, well, this guy is going to showcase to the world his innate ability by being put in different type of fields. But eventually, it could very well be the case that education overall is going to be a zero-sum game. So what matters is very much the allocation, knowing where to put the students in the right place. But overall, we shouldn't care too much about the fact that, well, higher education is still very low in terms of like overall number of higher education graduates. there is another view of the world, which is, well, actually, yes, there is a return at the social level to having more people graduate. That's a view of the world where a degree is not here just to signal your ability, it's also affecting your ability. It's giving you more skills, and these skills overall might affect the overall growth, the overall innovation process. And I think that's very much what Bianchi and Giorcelli are getting at. There might be different ways to actually get at this question of aggregate returns. One would be to just like essentially treat the whole population and see whether overall wages, overall earnings increase. What they do is slightly different, but I think actually quite interesting as well. To test whether education is affecting your ability, your productivity, they are taking individuals and randomly, in some sense, put them into a particular degree, and they see whether what they learn through that degree is affecting their productivity, their creativity, the outcome of which being the innovation that they are doing, they are patenting, okay? So it's a way of getting at this idea of aggregate returns by taking individuals, putting them into particular fields, and seeing whether that affects their productivity, their innovation outcome. And the answer here is that unambiguously, yes. Yes, actually, there are huge potential positive returns to increasing the total level of education. So overall level of education matters above and beyond just the allocation of particular students to particular fields. There are still two things that need to be kept in mind, especially for policymakers. The first is that, well, if you think that then the only thing to do is take all the cohorts and put them into higher education, well, you see that it's not going to work, because we also see from the results of Nicola that the firm environment plays a key role. It's not just about getting the skills, it's also about being able to use these skills in a firm and a labor market environment that values these skills in terms of creating innovation. The other thing that I found interesting is that, well, it also shows their paper that there is still quite a lot of signaling in the labor market that goes through diploma in Italian labor market, because it essentially shows that a lot of these students, by now getting these new degrees, were able to signal their ability in order to get into these executive or public employment positions that they were not eligible for before. So there is still a lot of signaling that goes on through diploma in the Italian labor market. Now, the last paper is also hugely important. It's tackling the issue of gender inequality, which is large overall, but especially in European countries and Southern European countries. So the question is then what to do about it, and why would we need to promote leadership roles for women? I think, well, the most obvious way is to think about it as the fact that there are just significant barriers to female career progression, and we actually saw that in the first paper as well, when we saw that the returns to these very convex career profiles in law and medicine and so on and so forth for women were actually negative compared to humanities. Okay? So there is a lot of difficulties for women to progress in these particular careers that are extremely convex, like law, medicine, and so on and so forth. There is a view that then what we should expect from these things is essentially spillover effects because of role model, belief formation, norm effects, because it would reduce discriminatory practices against women within the firm. It would potentially also increase the efficiency of firm decisions or performance. This is very much rooted in the idea that, you know, men have in general tendencies to be too competitive, and having women is going to essentially bring a little bit more quietness and deep reflection to firms' decision. I would like to really stress that there is a limitation, I think, to viewing the type of policies fostering women leadership just in this very instrumental way that, well, we're doing this because we're expecting some efficiency gains. I think, of course, we would be better off being able to remove all these particular frictions, all these particular barriers that create gender inequality. But sometimes it's complicated to identify them, and it's also very complicated to, in the very short run, make them go away. As a consequence, we shouldn't shy away from saying that, well, these type of policies that essentially are putting quotas in favor of women in boards, but in other places as well, are just motivated in the short run by equity concerns as well, okay? So seeing essentially through an instrumental way these policies like, oh, we're doing this because we believe society as a result is going to be better off because firms are going to be more efficient and so on and so forth, is, I think, somewhat limited. We should also just argue for these policies on equity grounds. I'm also saying that because, well, what we see is that the effects in the short term are kind of small. And should we worry about this? Well, I think we should also keep in mind that there are still many other serious impediments to women's career progression, and these small interventions can only do so much when you have all these things that are preventing women from engaging into these high career profiles like in law, in medicine, and so on and so forth. So again, when you want to put in place a policy that is going to change the norm, is going to affect the norm, well, the idea that you're going to just need gentle nudges is also, well, a little bit limited. At some point, you're going to need a bigger push if you really want to change the norm, affect beliefs, and that's something that policymakers should very much keep in mind. And I'm done. Thank you very much.